My research question is, what is the worship and church experience of wheelchair users in the Anglican Church? The resources and books I used in my research dealt with disability in a broad sense. But the main focus of this qualitative research is looking at the lived experiences of wheelchair users who worship in the Anglican Church, especially in the Diocese of Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. So why this question? The first reason is personal interest. Growing up, I was influenced by a number of relatives who had different kinds of disabilities, including some who were wheelchair users. Then, when I came to Halifax 18 years ago, and I began to attend the Anglican Church, I met a guy who was a burn survivor, and a lady with cerebral palsy who used an electric wheelchair. In recent years, I have also had a friend who is a wheelchair user. These friendships have allowed me to witness firsthand some of the struggles and barriers people with disabilities face every day. The second reason is that I have been noticing these last few years that we don't see very many people with disabilities in the Anglican Church. I got curious. Then I began wondering about the people with disabilities who are attending church, and wondering how they are actually experiencing worship and church in our local Anglican churches. I thought this might help shed some light on how the church is faring in its treatment of people with disabilities, and perhaps why there aren't more people with disabilities attending. It seems that in the Anglican Church, very little is known about how people with disabilities, and especially wheelchair users, experience church or the struggles they face in participating in the life of the church. The third reason is that although most other denominations have a disability policy, the Anglican Church of Canada does not appear to have one. The only exception, which just took effect on January 1st of this year, is Ontario. The Ontario government has implemented a disability policy called Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act 2005. That includes public spaces, including church spaces. So there, the Anglican Church has had no choice but to implement the disability policy. It seems the law of the land has forced the hand of the church. And other provincial governments could decide to pursue this as well, which could affect the Anglican Church here in Nova Scotia in the future. As I set out looking for participants who were adult wheelchair users in the Anglican Church in our Diocese of Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, I'm ahead of things, I found that participants were actually difficult to find at first. The participants I did interview were all adult women. This was not intentional. And a majority were electric wheelchair users. The number of years they have been wheelchair users ranges from 8 years to their entire life. 3 of the participants currently attend an Anglican church in this diocese. The 4th participant has actively attended an Anglican church for most of her life, but no longer is able to attend because of issues resulting from her disability. These aren't their real names, but I will call them Sandra, Mary, Vicky, and Susan. Disability is certainly not a new topic, and it is a social construct that tells us what is normal and what is not. Despite the fact that we live in a very individualistic society, we place much value on sameness. We seek conformity and have a problem with differences. Our Western culture still very much views disability as problems that somehow need fixing. The word disabled or handicapped has a negative connotation that keeps our focus on what is wrong, rather than focusing on the abilities of people with disabilities actually have. In recent years, words like physically challenged or differently abled have appeared in an attempt to shift this negative focus. Today, persons or people with disabilities is currently the most acceptable term. This term is used by disability groups, activists, as well as the World Health Organization and the Canadian government. Disabilities can be physical, psychological, or intellectual in nature, and there are a variety of definitions. The definition of disability that is most accepted today is a form of inability or limitation in performing roles or tasks expected of an individual within a social environment. There are two types of barriers to access and inclusion for people with disabilities. The first is physical structures, and the second is attitudes. The first is generally more costly, but the second one is at times the hardest one to change. People with disabilities are part of the marginalized of our society and are the largest of all minority groups. This particular group also tends to have higher rates of low income, unemployment, poverty, and discrimination. Within this group, women and children are the most vulnerable. The Canadian statistics show that 4.4 million adult Canadians reported having disabilities in 2006. Of all the different types of disabilities reported, mobility was one of the highest. Also, in Nova Scotia, it has the highest rate of disability of all the provinces at 20%, or 1 in 5 persons. These figures have all increased since 2001. It is important to note that these figures only capture reported cases, and that the number of people with disabilities is actually much higher. The results also confirm that disability rate in Canada increases steadily with age. This will have a tremendous impact in the next few years, as a large group of baby boomers begin to turn 65. By 2036, it is expected that the Atlantic provinces will have the highest proportion of seniors. Disability continues to be a significant issue that will not only need us to address it today, but will have growing impact years to come. Many of our churches are now already experiencing aging and declining congregations, and the statistics above show that disability and an increasingly aging population will have a tremendous impact on the church in the future. It could mean one of two things for the church: a further and more significant decline of church members, or the increasing number of seniors with disabilities may demand inclusion within the church. Research indicates women with disabilities are more vulnerable to violence and abuse than women without disabilities. The rates of sexual and physical abuse among women with disabilities are very high. Women with disabilities are also more likely to experience this violence and abuse at the hands of a greater number of perpetrators and for longer periods of time. Significant risk factors include poverty and one's level of dependence on others. My 4 research participants are women, and they are very dependent on others. So this is a real risk for them. Although it wasn't part of my questions, one participant did share an experience of this, and I'd like to share it with you now. Susan says, "My husband and I had just arrived in Halifax from another province. I was in a real bad emotional state. I had gone through a sexual assault and a court case. Honestly, I felt rejected by that whole province. Because unfortunately, although I won the case, it completely divided the town I was living in. They say that you can't go home again. I found that to be very true. When we got to Halifax, I was at the point of thinking that nobody wanted me, and I was even thinking, why is this guy," and she was pointing at her husband, "even sticking around?" Susan then continued, "When we walked past the Anglican church that weekend we arrived, I felt something calling me. I remember it so clearly. It was a sunny day, and as I went in the door, I could see his face. Couldn't see his face, but he was saying, 'Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad to see you.' I was blown away. I said, 'Wow.' I hadn't heard anything like that in so long because of all that junk that was going on in my life. Over time, I was able to get rid of most of my anger and most of my hurt. And in many ways, I became Susan again. Maybe a different Susan." Three main themes emerged from the research data that I collected from my 4 participants. The themes are accommodations, attitudes, and community. In biblical times, people with infirmities and disabilities were separated and marginalized from the rest of society. It was believed that their condition was a direct result of sin and divine punishments. Even in our recent history, people with disabilities were treated harshly. People with disabilities were segregated and kept away from the rest of society. They either stayed at home or were institutionalized. No accommodations in society or church were necessary during that time. Sandra says, "There are more and more people with disabilities and people in wheelchairs around these days. We are a more visible minority. The attitude with younger people has improved, but need a bit more work on the older generations. The reason younger people are more mindful is perhaps because they now have people that go to their schools who are in wheelchairs. People with disabilities aren't segregated anymore. And in the past 30 years, people with disabilities and activist groups came together as one voice to demand equal opportunity and an end to discrimination. And we know, as a result, laws and regulations have been implemented that have enabled people with disabilities, especially that of mobility, to access public areas as well as prevent discrimination. The church, however, has been slower to implement access to its buildings, and the issue of money has often been stated as the reason. Vicky says, "I see a lot more Anglican churches now that have ramps." And Sandra says, "I always need to look into accessibility of buildings ahead of time. I always have to make sure that where I would like to go is accessible and that I can get in there, because many things aren't really accessible even in this day and age. In some cases, you have to ask what they mean by accessible, because accessibility means different things to different people." Sandra also says, in church buildings that are not accessible, the people there just don't realize the issues until they've got somebody as a parishioner that needs to go in, or a visitor that would like to go in. For some reason, they just don't stop and think of these things. Perhaps because they can walk over and around things. It's just no big deal for them. My research shows that having a ramp or calling one's building accessible does not always mean full accessibility. My research also shows that accessible washrooms is a key issue for people with disabilities. This is a comfort most of us don't have to worry about. But it is the first thing my participants scope out when they're somewheres new. Even here in our present worship space, where we are today, this is an issue, because the washrooms are downstairs and are not accessible to wheelchair users, as the chairlift is old and doesn't work properly. We live in an ableist society where things are geared towards the able-bodied norm, and so accommodations have to be made to make things accessible for people with disabilities. These accommodations simply allow people with disabilities equal opportunity to access the various places and services that people without disabilities can easily access. Although there have been many improvements, there is still much more that needs to be done, as much of society and our churches are still not fully accessible. In some ways, it seems as though things are seen more as an accommodation rather than a right when it comes to accessibility issues. There now seems to be an attitude of resignation among those with disabilities in terms of expecting places and services to be accessible. In other words, it seems as though people with disabilities are much more accepting of the fact that things are not accessible. So, in a sense, they are enabling the ableist culture to continue. People with disabilities appear to be more understanding and thankful for what they are provided by society and the church, even if it is not full access or full inclusion. Vicky says, "I suppose I could nitpick, but overall I think the churches are trying." And Sandra says, "It's just the way of life. I just accept the fact that no, I can't get in there, so go and find another place. It is what it is." Mary says, "As far as going to church goes, it's very difficult because a lot of the older churches are not geared for wheelchairs. Certainly you feel frustrated. Anybody would. But what can you do?" Susan says, "The wheelchair pew is at the back of the church. I don't like it. But they say they can't change it because of fire regulations." In regards to attitudes, the first thing all my participants seem to mention is their own attitude towards their disability and of being a wheelchair user. Sandra says, "It's simply part of my life. I don't even think about it anymore. I'm part of the chair. That's where I live in." The wheelchair is a tool. It's my feet, getting me around where I need to go. Mary says, here I'm quoting St. Paul, "In whatever state I am in, therein be content." Attitude means an awful lot. and how well you accept whatever happens to be your lot in life. I do get frustrated, but I try to be very upbeat about it. Vicky says, you have to accept what you have. I try to think positively rather than focusing on the things I can't do anymore. And Susan, she says, I think it's my responsibility to have the right attitude and to let other people see that having a disability is not a tragedy. Here is my take on this, and not everyone feels this way, but I view my disability as a gift from God. I've done more with my life because I have a disability than I would have been able to do without it. As I began to reflect on these comments, I began to think needing glasses to see properly could, in a sense, be considered a disability. But the glasses are tools, just as wheelchairs are tools that enable my participants to get around. Although people generally don't notice glasses, a person in a wheelchair is at times seen and treated differently, simply because of the chair. Participants generally found negative experience out in society. For example, Vicky says, it's how people treat you. Because you have a physical disability, they think that you have a mental disability too. Sandra says, we used to say a lot of people automatically think that we're stupid, that we have no education, and that we are dumber than dumb. We are poorer than poor, and we're deaf. They have no idea what our disability is, or what our problems are, except that we're sitting in a chair. But they think you have all kinds of things wrong with you. But people are more accepting of disability now, more or less. And Vicky says, people do funny things. People don't talk to me. They talk to the person I am with. I am aware of people who have had very negative experiences in the Anglican churches. However, all my participants seem to report only very positive experiences within their churches, which is a very good thing. For example, Sandra says, within the church, people's attitude has always been good. There, I am just a person. When I asked the participants if being wheelchair users restricted their participation in worship, the majority said no. Sandra says, I can participate fully in worship. At the church I'm at, they give communion at the bottom of the step, so I can go and get communion myself. Susan says, I would have to say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I'm not likely to be asked to be a reader, even though I could. I am also not likely to be asked to do a sermon, even though I know I could. Mary says, I can sing hymns and worship just as good sitting down. And Vicky tells us, in worship, no, not at all. The priest and assistants are really accommodating as far as communion, and they bring it down to me, and I appreciate that. Now, as you know, we are relational beings. We were created to be in right relationship with God and with one another. We all want to have a sense of belonging. So being a part of a faith community is very important. As Christians, we believe that we have all been given various gifts and that we are to use these gifts to the glory of God. Yet, we seem to exclude people with disabilities from sharing their gifts and from being full participants in the life of the church, the body of Christ. Even St. Paul reminds us that we are many parts, each with abilities and limitations, yet make one body. The faith community seems important to my participants, not necessarily because it's a social network or connection, but they do mention it in its importance because it has always been a part of their lives. Sandra says, "Church has always been a part of my life, so I go when I can." Mary says, "I've been an Anglican all my life. If it wasn't so difficult to get to church, I would go more often." And Vicky says, "I grew up in the Anglican Church. Being part of a faith community has helped me deal with my disability." The faith community seems to be important. And although we see that more Anglican churches have ramps, we still don't see very many wheelchair users in our churches. In 2010, research in the United States showed us that people with disabilities are less likely than those without disabilities to attend church. And this was by a 50% to 57% margin. And the greater the disability, the less likely a person is to participate. Although I can't find Canadian research in regards to this, I suspect the same is true for Canadian churches. When I asked my participants why people with disabilities might not be coming to church, no one could provide me with any reasons. Sandra did say, though, wheelchair users are a much more visible minority in our society, but not in the church. And when you are the only one in a wheelchair, you really feel like you stand out. Any questions?
Helen?
Thanks, Barb. As someone who's been an advocate for persons with disabilities for the last 25 years, and a consultant and advisor to both the city and other groups and organizations, there's a couple of things that I've observed over the years, and one is that the definition of disability is extremely fluid, and it's both can be seen from a subjective and an objective kind of way. Though that 20% of Canadians who identify as persons with disabilities includes a spectrum of various disabilities, as well as individuals who have hidden disabilities.
Yep.
So in churches where there may be people with visible disabilities that are very few, there may be people who self-identify on that survey as having disabilities. So they're there.
Yes, that's true.
But there's that subjective kind of idea of disability. What one person considers a disability, another might not.
Yep.
For themselves. And then there's, of course, the more the more objective, which is like what the Canadian government will accept as for giving you money or services, a tax credit, a definition along medical lines. In terms of accessibility, that's another very fluid term. And in terms of churches and other public buildings, I think one thing you didn't mention was the universal standards. They exist. There are universal standards, and the reason they're important is that what works for one person may not work for another person. So when you're you're trying to make your church more accessible, your whatever building, you have to kind of go with a standard which allows the greatest access to the greatest number of people. The problem in this country, I think, is that, as you pointed out, there's only Ontario, Manitoba as well has a Disabilities Act, and BC. But in terms to act, a national act, we don't have one like America does. So there's no real incentive to, across the country, to improve, to make it a mandate, a priority. And another thing that I've noticed, you talked about attitudes, the women commenting they don't know why people with disabilities aren't in churches or aren't observed in churches. Yeah, I think there's that's a very interesting question that I think merits further attention. I guess my own kind of experience would say it's the same as with anything else. Any other reason why you don't see people with disabilities at certain clubs, at certain events, and a lot of that has to do with, there's physical access to the building and with the travel access, the problem around trying to get to church, booking your Accessibus, which, by the way, is only running for medical appointments.
Yeah, it is only partial.
And,
but my participants have no trouble getting to church because they all actually live really close.
Right.
But I know it is an issue for a lot of people.
Right. I don't know why people are not going to churches. Probably the same reason other people are not going to churches. But
true enough.
Part of it is that culture of that ableist culture, and of being felt, being immediately kind of singled out as, oh, we will accommodate you. We're going to make you different right now. We're going to make sure that we treat you differently, and you become evident, and it's an uncomfortable place for anyone to be. Why would they go there if they're going to stand out and be singled out when they want to be part of a community? So that's part of it.
Well, thanks for your comments.
I really enjoyed that. In the 60s is when they first started making travel accessible for handicapped people, as they were called then. And I mean, the 60s was a huge time for making changes, for standing up for people, for equality and all of that. And you would think after all the years with the government knowing that accessibility is a huge issue, I mean, people today can get into libraries and arts events and grocery stores, but they can also get into things like casinos, strip clubs, all those kinds of things, super accessibility. And so as we enable people with needs like that, why is the church not seen as one of those most important areas of needs in people's lives? Do you think there's a reason for that? I mean, there's all kinds of grants you can apply for accessibility, except it doesn't seem to extend to churches.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure actually. Something I'd like to explore a bit more, but I'm not quite sure what the answer is at all.
I also enjoyed this very much, and it's really got me thinking. And I will theologically reflect on it somewhat, as something that's just come to me during your presentation that I'm going to think about some more, and that is coming from a small three-point charge we have churches, it's boiling back down to buildings, and this love of buildings that seems to go on. And in our churches, the washrooms are not accessible in 2 out of the 3. You can either go to the hall or you can go to the worship, but you can't go to both should we have a dinner or anything like that. So it is really an exclusion. But what it made me think is this, is that at the nursing home that my mother is in, I do services there occasionally, and I've come to notice that we're actually having more people show up at that service, and it's because it's not just for the residents, it's for adult daycare and anybody in the community who wants to come. And what I've noticed is a lot of the people from my own church are coming into that service on Wednesday. They have accessible bathrooms. It's all on one level. And because people have a handicap, it doesn't mean they're any less or any more in need of the blessings of Jesus. They're like us. Everybody who wants that wants it. And so I hadn't associated before how this daycare service is actually eclipsing our service in town until now. And I think it's got to do with, as Helen said, some people, you can't see their disabilities. And it may be that they are able to walk into the church, but maybe it's a real strain for them. And they just choose not to. So once again, I think, you know, it's making me think quickly about how perhaps we need to pull out of those buildings to have a service not for handicapped people, for everyone in a different location.
Thank you.
Well done, Barb. It's interesting. I just want to make a comment on what it feels like in the room, and it feels like the talk and the presentation has generated a lot of emotion in people's lives, in some way either apologizing or feeling ashamed or needing to justify. One question I would like to ask you, Barb, or ask you to say a bit more about, is you make a comment about midway through about how disabled people have now learned to accommodate the ableist society. Could you say a bit more about that?
Well, I guess they just, I don't know if they've resigned, like if they've resigned to the fact that things aren't changing, and so it's either be accepting or leave. They just, it seems like there really is no choice for them. So they have to accept it and be grateful for what they actually do get.
I'm drawn, when I'm listening to the song that Louis Armstrong sings about smile and the whole world smiles with you, and you cry alone. Was there that sense of that with your participants?
They didn't come out and say anything like that, but hearing them just kind of say, you know, it is what it is, it almost like there is no sense of complaining, because as people often say, you know, if you complain, nobody's going to want to listen to you. Yeah, I guess if you complain too much about how things aren't accessible, you know, people don't receive that very well. Even though there are things that people need and accommodations that they have a right to have. The church has to do a bit more work, I guess.
Yeah.
One more question. No, it's okay.
Just want to add some observations from rural Nova Scotia. I very much echo what you found. It certainly is the case in the Sheet Harbour area on the Eastern Shore right now that the hospital nursing home has become the venue that draws people with disabilities and also their friends and family. And I think the clergy of all denominations are trying to respond to that. The other piece I've observed when I was a rural rector is one of my churches did actually come up with the bucks to put in a chairlift that worked so that there could be accessibles. I don't know what people were like physically in the past, but all the Anglican rural churches I've ever looked after have had flights of stairs that, you know, would put off a whole lot of people. So one of them did get a chairlift and, you know, kind of advertised it in their advertising and to the members, and it was infrequently used. And I asked directly a number of people who were not in wheelchairs, but were using walkers or such. And there was still a big discomfort.
Yep.
In, you know, being seen to be using it, putting people out, and all that kind of stuff. And we never did kind of come to understand that fully before I left the parish. But I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I didn't find that from my participants. The couple that did comment on using chairlifts have commented that they feel quite vulnerable when they use the chairlift because they have no control, and sometimes it's a very small space that they kind of seem to be hanging from, and a lot of them are very uncomfortable with that. Their sense of security is jarred. So I think that might be part of it. It's not the most, they don't feel safe when they're on it. I know it technically is, but it's how the two that did mention it, it's just, they just don't feel, they're happy when they get back on the ground, because they don't feel quite as safe on it, even though they're built to be.
I want to thank Barb Hache for a fascinating presentation.